Hi, I'm Canadian artist Roxanne Jervis, and someone by the name of Dreadnought sent me a very nice email and was saying how they like to learn how to paint barns with a palette knife. So I'm going to show you some of the barns that I did. These barns were red, which are really nice to paint, especially in the winter scene. And I will also show you how to do the gray barns, which are traditional barns that we see around the countryside. So I'll give you a little history of the barns that I've got here first. This barn here is in London on Hall's Mill Road, and it's the only hickory barn left in Canada. So a lot of us go out there as our gallery painting group, and we go out there to paint. So we've done this barn here, and this piece here is also the same barn, but when I painted this, I was looking at it from the side. So you can see here's the door. This part here would be what's sticking out here, and you don't see all of this because it's covered by trees. I'll bring these as a close-up. There's the first barn from the side view, and it's done on a more hazy look, but one of the things I wanted to impress on people when they do paint barns is try to really make a sharp contrast between the shadow side and the bright side. So you can see here how all the shadows are really making the red stand out. The one up on top is a front view, and we were looking up the lane towards the barn. Then I have another barn we went and painted, and there were a lot of barns around, but I found the light in this one coming between the barns to be really interesting for me. It was just, I was the only one that painted that angle, but to me it was very interesting to see the darks and the lights, but the sun shining through down the path. There are other buildings that I've done with the barn tones. Now this one is the Godreach salt mine, and I have my paintings here with plastic over to keep the dust. That's the Godreach salt mines, and the roofs were rust, but the red is what really made it jump. And the feed mill, this feed mill is in Wellesley. They've torn it down now, and again, the roof was kind of all rusted out. I punched a bit more red in to give it a bit more contrast, but you can see the colors on the side of the feed mill are more the colors of a barn that you would get out in the actual countryside. The Blaine barn, we were painting on location, and most of the people painted the barn. The rest of the barn was off to my right, but this was just the little attachment. I don't know what they actually did in here, but it was just a single room. And I found this way more interesting. Commenting on what you're going to do when you see a barn. I had taken these two pictures in the winter time, and it was way in the distance. I'd blown them up. But do you really want to paint exactly what you see? When you saw my other barns, you saw they were close-ups. This particular barn was way off in the distance. There were huge trees in here. I did quick sketch to see which would work best. There were 3 small silos. I cut them out. I took off a lot of the other things. I like the windmill. I like the composition. One of the things you have to be aware of is make sure, even though in the picture the silo was dead center, you want your composition to have the highest point at the 1/3 mark, either from the left or the right side. An easy way to sort through this is put the photo on your computer and play around with cropping to get the actual balance of what you want to do. If you want to paint the whole barn, maybe this barn should only be painted that much. If you're doing a horizontal one, you want a bit more in it, but be aware that you don't want a lot of dead space in the sky. So you have to make sure when you're doing your composition that the sky is not just a big massive area. You need to break up that space. This bit. One of the things that I like to do is figure out what size canvas stretcher I'm going to make. And the actual image, I had drawn an outline here for an 11 by 14 canvas stretcher, but it's a profile canvas, which means it's 1.5 inches wide on the outside here. And I always like to paint my subject around the corner of the stretcher. So when I do figure out what I'm going to do, then I put in just titanium white, or use an eraser and erase the lines, but titanium white to cover those lines, and then throughout the painting more paint will go on top of it, but that way I can make sure that I've got my subject matter in the center of the page so it will go on a stretcher. For those of you who want to paint along with me, there's a big change in the actual composition I'd like you to be aware of. I had made these barn buildings way too tall. They had actually come down to here and then gone back on an angle like this. So what I would like you to be aware of is when you see every part of the painting, consider using these higher lines of the walls. I used permanent rows in just a few places here and here to go over top of the red. And I think you will find that this newer composition will be of great help. So good luck. I hope you enjoy the video. Today I'm going to be painting on a real canvas sheet, and the reason I do this is sometimes I don't want to haul along a lot of full stretch canvases, especially if you're going out traveling. And you can get these, and it's called a Frederick's Medium Texture Real Artist Canvas. Beware of canvas paper. Also, some of the places you can buy canvas on a board, and I've painted on it. It doesn't have the same touch as the real canvas, and when you're done, you just bring it home, the painting home, hang it up on a hanger with clothes pegs. But you can see here, when you're done, then you can just put this on a piece of foam core and stick it into a frame, or you can just lay it flat until you decide you want to frame it. This painting was done at Kamoka Ponds, but I did it on canvas sheet. If you're traveling, when it dries, it rolls up really well also. So that's what I'm using today. It'll be good for demonstration because I will do a red barn and I will do another barn here for Dreadnought. When you start painting a barn, it's always a good idea to do a thin wash of the outline, because if it's not quite right, you can just remove it. I've got a bit of mineral spirits on a brush and I'll be using burnt sienna. So I will do the one side of the barn red and the other side of the barn in the gray tones. So just to get my perspective right, this is what I'm working from here, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, do I want this perfectly flat? Because as you can see, this is a very horizontal painting. I will probably put the field at the back, not quite so flat, but just thin wash. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. Closest corner for this portion of the barn, and I'm going to make the barn bigger. Here's the closest corner. Angle with your brush to there. Angle to there. Angle down for the roof. This is for your perspective. This is slightly downhill. Nice thing about red barns is they have a nice white paint to outline it, which is really a lot of fun. The silo. Now here, unfortunately, my silo is dead center, so I'm going to have to crimp the barn a wee bit, and maybe I won't make the silo quite as big. Okay, measure from there, from here to here. Okay, it's not dead center. That's good. So I'm reducing the silo, which is artistic license. You can do that. Just a rough sketch. Get your placement on the page. The silo is lower than the barn, I'm seeing, so the silo will come down to about here. And then the angle of the left side of the barn is like this, and it comes in about there. Here, bring it down a wee bit. And we'll have to make it a little bit narrower so it can fit on the canvas. And I think I'd like to put the roof here. That back section of the barn is here, and it's a pointed roof there, and then it sways out here. And one of the things you always have to be aware of is the eaves. And I think the vertical is here, not where I put it originally, because when you have a building, you don't normally see this going right to the point. If you look at houses, there's always an overhang. So you can see how I've now taken this picture here. Can you see? This is the barn, and we just played a little bit of in and out with it. I didn't want this coming off the full because Make it narrower because it is narrower there. And all of this will be covered up eventually. I'm going to bring this barn here and put one of these feed silos down here in front. Make this doorway a bit smaller to fit that feed silo in. And then there's a bit of sky coming in here. I've given it a bit more height. So there's your sketch. It doesn't take long to figure that out. And if you don't like it, you just, fill in. It's so thin, there's nothing much happening there. Maybe I could make this from here to here. Maybe I could make this a wee bit fat. No, I like it like that. So that's how you get started with something. Don't spend a long time sketching it. Just throw it on with a bit of burnt sienna, and you'll find that these lines will change a wee bit. Maybe I'm going to have a bit of a driveway coming in just to give this a join to the bottom of the canvas. And I think we're all set. So I will put the sky in, and I'll stop the video for that. And then when I come back, we'll start on the barn. I've decided to put a thin wash of the burnt sienna in the sky. And one of the things you can do when you figure out where your shadows are on the sides of the barns, it's a good idea to do that at this point. And again, you can use your burnt sienna and just block in really dark where your shadows are with your brush. Here, this is all dark in here because you do want to have some very darks to contrast with the very lights. And the side of the silo will also be dark. And a little bit right here. Okay, that's where the darks will be. And I can see I have too much mineral spirits on here. So I'm going to I'll work on the sky while the mineral spirits down here dry off. I've gotten into the habit of painting the sky with the brush, especially when there's a large area because it gives you nice texture. I've put on the titanium white like you do with your palette knife. And then you start with the strong color, especially if it's a winter scene, and working the color in. And as you get closer to the horizon, it gets much paler, especially in the winter. There's more atmosphere between you and the distance. And also in the winter paintings, there always seems to be more of a glow closer to the horizon. So I've taken cerulean blue, and you see how I'm holding this brush? Background doesn't have to be as thick as the foreground. So I'm just slowly working the color, and I'm also wanting to make sure I get to that 1.5 inch edge for my gallery canvas. And I can still see my line in there, so I will put more paint on. I'm going to extend this building out again like we had planned. So it goes over the side. And sometimes picking up a bit of that burnt sienna in the sky gives the sky a nice glow. In the summer, the palette knife works really well for those clear skies, but in the winter, I often find the brush just gives it a little bit more interest in the areas that are going to be shown. am working with a totally dry brush, trying not to get any mineral spirits or Turks or anything in it. And I'm trying to keep the paint in the sky fairly thin. The rule of paint is fat over lean, which means thin paint in the background and thicker paint as you come to the foreground. Now, knowing that the top of the silo is going to be fairly light, I'm going to add more blue so there's a bit of dark behind it, just for the contrast. So dark against light, against dark, against light. And if you find when you're all done with that, you don't like the brush strokes, this is where your palette knife comes in, no paint on it, and you can smooth the paint down, or you can come across and give your sky that softer look with the palette knife. And I see lines. I may have to come back later when the sky is dry, because my pencil lines I should have erased. And they're showing through a wee bit, but don't be afraid to paint with your not the normal hand. I'm right-handed, but sometimes you can get some much more interesting brush strokes if you use your left hand. And see how I'm twisting the brush this way and that way. Don't just do lines like this all the way across. That's really kind of boring when you get down to looking at the finished work. Don't be afraid to come over your lines, because the silo's in front of the sky and you want to have the sky right up to the silo and the roof of the barn. And please do not go around the barn with your brush like this. Come down in, come up, and then that will make it a little bit easier. When I started, I should have ironed this piece of paper because I had folded it by mistake. Doesn't hurt to clean your brush off or your knife off down here. By doing that, it brings some of the sky color into the bottom, and even though you may not use it, could be covered up. It's a good idea to clean off the brush and the knife down in this area. I just find it gives the painting more life. Okay. I'm just going to let that rest for a while, and I'll be back. One of the things people don't realize when they're doing a painting is that it takes probably 2 or 3 days in order to figure out how you're going to approach the subject matter. That's why doing a quick sketch or taking a picture can help you with it. You can see how I changed it even at the last minute. I was going to do a landscape with everything in it, but I rather like focusing more on the actual subject matter rather than the whole countryside. So I was trying to figure out at the beginning, how would I demonstrate this for Dreadnought, the person who gave me that lovely comment, and decided that this is how I would do it. So when you're doing barns and buildings of any sort, don't put the roof on first. Always start with the barn, because the roof comes over top of the barn. If there's going to be a few trees in the background, I may put some in on the one side, even though they will hang off on the left. But the other thing is, artistic license allows you to change the colors. You don't want to have a photographic painting. You want to have your impression of what you're seeing, and you want it to be coming alive. So I will put a few trees in. I may end up taking them out again at the end, but I will put them in so that they're lower. I'm going to get an eye line coming from here down to the trees in the distance. My fingernail has scratched into the sky how high I want those trees to be. You don't want everything, as I said earlier, to be horizontal, horizontal, horizontal. This makes a much more interesting composition. Because I'm using a small area, I will use my small palette. This is what I usually use when I'm doing a bigger area, like the silo. I might get away with the big one because there's a bigger width, but here I'm going to need the smaller one. Here I can use the bigger one. You will see me changing back and forth from these two. Always, always make sure you wipe off the paint off your blade. I don't like to see any paint on there, and it looks like I didn't clean this blade very well. But this is what gives you your lovely smooth surfaces. So for the trees in the background, I'm going to need olive green. Because it's a winter scene, olive green is more the color of the background trees. I use Winsor Newton olive green, Winsor Newton sap green, permanent green, which I don't like. I will definitely not use that for a winter scene, but I've been able to tone it down with a red pigment or burnt sienna. Someone gave me this too, and I've been reluctantly using it. And then a little bit of yellow ochre. Make a really good combination. So for the trees in the background, I'm putting olive green and yellow ochre on my blade at the same time, but I'm not mixing them. I put them on just at the same time, so they will mix on the canvas. And if I need to give it a bit of a punch, tiny bit of sap green over top. And this is where the horizon line is for that background field. So better scrape off some of that. And this will almost always be around the side. I'm going to clean this blade off just down in here. There wasn't much paint on, but when you get it down in there, it actually ends up being a bit of the shadow in the snow. Not by planning, just by accident. Weathered barn board. What I do is I put on my blade, first of all, I put on here a little bit of titanium white. This is how much I have. Where the barn is, when you're coming down, you can come down straight or you can come down on an angle, but bring your blade down straight. I see there's a touch of blue in my white, doesn't matter. You don't want the paint too thick, but you want to make sure you've covered the canvas. Okay, cleaning off some of that paint. Again, you can see there wasn't much paint on there. Now I'm going to pick up Payne's Gray with a slight touch of burnt sienna. Do not use black. If you don't have Payne's Gray, mix ultramarine and burnt sienna together and give it a nice true gray color. That's my Payne's Gray. And because usually the water on a barn, it's darker at the bottom just because of all the water in the barn. Put the whole blade on the side and just draw it up. A little more Payne's Gray. I think I need a bit more white on it. Be careful not to put too much on. Leave this off here. And I'm dragging it over, but I'm not mixing it. So you're just getting here. See, there's a ridge there, so I'm going to carry it up. That green, I don't like the green. Scratch it off. And under the eave, you will get a little bit of dark just under the eave, so that most of the dark will be there. And there is your barn board. If you want to then take the side of your blade and just cut in a few bits of board, no paint. Can you see the thin little lines in here? Now the other thing you can do is you can take a little bit of burnt sienna, and hardly any on the side of the blade, and you can put a few lines in with the burnt sienna. and then just drag it down. Keeping in line your perspective. So that's your gray. And I could do this one in the darker tones, and that would just be Payne's Gray and Burnt Sienna side by side. Getting the darks in for the shadow side of the building. Up from the bottom if you have to. I notice there are a few really dark windows in there. That's where I will use ultramarine. Putting some on the tip of the blade. I made that into a door just because the brush went that far. So right now that seems like a very harsh contrast, but you can always add a little bit of white to it if you want to tone it down, and you can actually scratch in bits of the drawing, the tip of your blade, because the paint is wet, and then you don't want it to be solid, so just drag over a wee bit, not too much. Well, that breaks it up a wee bit. You can see there's an illusion of a door, an illusion of a window. Oops. If you have a stick or the end of a large paintbrush, it's called a Maul Stick. And you can rest it on the edge of your easel and then rest your hand on it to give you a bit more control. Another thing that you can change from your winter scenes is, especially with red barns, is to paint the roofs green, or with gray barns, paint the roofs red. I think I will paint the roofs green here. And after we're all done, I'm actually going to turn this into a red barn, but I wanted to show you how to do it with the grays. Now what you do is you do the same thing on this side, only using burnt sienna and red. So the bright side is in here. So I have burnt sienna and red on here. And I'm just drawing it down. And I know that the barn, this actually side's going to be there. So then this side will be darker. It will still be red and burnt sienna, but it will have a darker side to it. So the darker side comes like this. Nice clean strokes down. Now the red I'm using in this case is Azo Coral. Unbelievably not coral. You can see it has a vibrancy to it, as opposed to Cad Red, which has more of a brick color to it. Slightly different, but there's more pink in the Cad Red, and I find the Azo Red with the burnt sienna makes a good combination, but you can use Cad Red as well. So these are the two colors that you can work with on this, and a really nice transparent burnt sienna. putting in some Payne's Gray with this because it is the dark side of the building. If you find you're getting too much paint on, just slightly take it off as if you're taking butter off a slice of bread. Now, because I'm wanting this to be a red barn, so it's all together as one unit, I am going to go back over the other side while I've got these colors in my mind. So let's see what happens over this gray. Too much white on. So I will scrape this off. And since the silo is kind of gray, I'll just put some of that in here. When you're changing color, clean off the blade. So red, more red. Ah, nice. Yeah, that's coming along nicely. Now I need a thinking break. What am I going to do next? You think? I've done a bit more work on this. I've put some dark shadows here, underneath here and here. I put more red in here, cleaned up the line to get the perspective right because it's on an angle. And if you see two sides of a building, they both have to be on an angle of some sort. So here and here. And the next thing you paint that's furthest away is not the roof. It's this little bit of snowy field back here. So do take care in making sure you get things on in the right order, because it makes a lot of difference. I should have put it in before I actually did the barn. That pushes the barn back. Make sure the horizon is not halfway. And halfway, okay. Cleaning this off, I'm going to put a bit more white. Take the small knife, just go horizontally. Don't start right at the barn or you'll get more paint there. Start out here and then work back in. There. And then I'm just cutting snow inches here. Picking up whatever bits of color are there, because you do get reflected light in your snow. And your barn isn't always perfect because the snow is going up against it. All right. Now, one of the things red barns have is they have lovely white lines around all of their windows and doors, and I tend to leave that near the end, and I'll do it with a brush just because I want this paint to be a little bit dry. I'll have to come back tomorrow perhaps and do that. I'm going to do the roof now, and the roof's going to be in a bright green, probably sap green to start, and then we'll see what the color works out like. Winsor Newton sap green, it's as dark as your ultramarine blue. Oh, by the way, I did put ultramarine blue over the sides of the barn here to give it more dark. Rather than the Payne's gray, the blue is richer. And using the blue right out of the tube, basically, I haven't mixed it with anything. You get this transparency coming through, and it's a lovely, lovely color. The same with this, is when you see that green on the palette, it's the same intensity of dark as the blue, as your purple, as your Payne's gray, and your olive green. So you have to kind of put your paint in the same place every time so you know what color you're picking up. So here's my green, pretty dark. That's too dark for what I want, but we'll just scrape it on, and remember that the eave comes lower than where the side barn comes in, where the vertical comes in here. Use the bigger knife for this. And you can go from the bottom up. And that little bit of burnt sienna showing in there is kind of nice. That's from my original sketch. And bring in that side eave there. I think I'll put a bit of yellow ochre in here just to break the green up. Again, I'm not mixing it ahead of time, I'm letting it mix on the canvas. Okay, take the time to stand back and look at something. I'm finding that this red is not strong enough, but we will come back later and just hype it up a bit more. It just needs a tad of that strong color. Now this is more on the shadow side, so this part of the roof will be darker than this green roof, even though they're both going to start with the same green. Be aware of the differences in the sunlight on the buildings. Not a strong enough angle. That's not a strong enough angle. Found my first mistake. So scrape this off. Scrape it off. I'm going to start with the cloth. I'm going to come from the sky down because I don't want to carry that green into the sky. Always finding a clean spot. Whoa, see, that was not good. We do make mistakes, don't we? that's making a nice, interesting sky. We will continue with the blade. Now, because I've used the blade on this side, I do have to put some of the same strokes on the other side, or I think it's two different paintings, which it isn't. Whoops. Looks like we're getting a few clouds in this painting. Maybe we'll work on that. If you're having clouds, make sure they don't end up in the beginning. Have them strongly to the 1/3 on the left, or the rule of thirds. I call it X's and O's, but my students seem to understand that very easily. But the rule of thirds is another way of explaining it. Interesting. This is a dry brush with no mineral spirits on it. I'm going to just try and rough this in, see if I can get the right angles. Using up some of this paint that came off of there. Really what I'm doing is just covering some of the canvas so that when I put the snow on, those colors will just shine right through. And I won't have to worry about having the canvas showing. Somehow or other I've scratched in here something. So I'm just going to get rid of it. It's so simple. the things about painting a building is soften the verticals so you don't have really crisp lines. Like here you don't see a crisp line, here you don't see a crisp line. This one's a bit crisp, so you just take your baby finger and slightly draw it down. Some more red in there. And now your line is not as solid as what painting it with a brush. Oh, I'm getting worse instead of better here. But it just softens the line a bit. And removing excess paint. This time I'm mixing for this part of the roof sap green and cadmium yellow because this is in the sunshine. If it's too light, you can always throw a little bit of dark over it. But you're just ensuring that you know the sun shining on it. And when you stand back, if it's not light enough, grab another light color. I'm using olive green here. Too much on there. Need the brush. There is a very narrow side silo on this building. When you look at the drawing very closely, you can see it, but it's not easily seen from my photograph, with the little dome coming right here. If you want to put some trees in the background further behind these, you can just take a slight bit of blue, hardly any, and it will mix with the wet paint. By doing this, it also removes some of that volume of blue sky. Even though the barn have that in the background. It's one way of just extending the colors into the sky. At this point, you can decide to either make this a snow scene, or you can make it into a summer scene by adding more greens and yellows and soil colors. For those of you living somewhere that don't have snow, I suggest you do that. Otherwise, if you want to make it into a snow scene, go ahead.